Today we're going to be discussing one of the several learning theories. Today we're going to be going over classical conditioning, which was developed by Ivan Pavlov. He is a very renowned psychologist who studied the results of dogs and how they would respond to stimuli. Humans and animals alike learn and adapt to their environments, and through classical conditioning we're able to predict and expect good or bad experiences. Classical conditioning is also related to operant conditioning, as classical conditioning allows us to prepare for significant events, while operant conditioning allows us to perform specific actions that will either lead in good or bad events. So basically, if one decides to repeat an action that they know will result in a good outcome, they will most likely learn to do that. The concept is called association. We associate good outcomes with good behaviors, and therefore we repeat good behaviors in order to receive good outcomes, and vice versa. Our minds basically connect events in sequence. We understand that something good is a result of an action, or something bad is a result of another action, but this also leads to something called habits. Habits form when specific actions are related to a specific context, and therefore the next time we experience that context, such as going to a movie theater, we will feel provoked to have to experience that same behavior, like perhaps getting popcorn at the movie theater. It's actually quite easy to perform habits. It takes about only 66 days for a behavior to become a habit. In classical conditioning, we learn to associate two stimuli with each other. For instance, like the flash of lightning with the sound of thunder. In regards to classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov is probably one of the most profound and renowned psychologists of the 20th century. Pavlov's most famous experiment is that of the dog experiment. Pavlov wanted to figure out why do dogs salivate. So he introduced them to a stimulus, which is like their food, and their natural behavior is to salivate when they come in contact with the food. Pavlov wanted to figure out, well, what would happen if I replace the food with a different stimuli? So, basically, in his experiment, he would introduce a second stimuli, such as the ringing of a bell, and when the dog was presented with the food, they would also hear the ringing of the bell. Then the dog would associate the ringing of the bell with the coming of food. So, in his follow-up experiment, he would be able to see the dog salivate with just the ring of the bell and no food present. This is because the dog associated the sound of the ringing with that of the coming of food. Through this experiment, Pavlov was able to separate two different kinds of stimuli, conditioned stimuli and unconditioned stimuli. Stimuli is that of learned stimuli, while unconditioned is unlearned. Basically, a dog or a human can have a conditioned stimulus, and that is when they're exposed to something that is a natural and unlearned stimulus or response, and that is paired with something else. They will basically learn to evoke that response when that other stimuli is present. It was known as associative learning. There are many different processes and steps in that of classical conditioning. The first one is acquisition. Acquisition is the initial learning of the association. Basically, Pavlov introduced the idea that the stimuli has to be introduced simultaneously with the other stimuli in order for them to become associated. They can't be introduced previously or after. The second facet of classical conditioning is that of extinction and spontaneous recovery. Basically, regarding extinction, if the stimuli is presented again and again without any result, the animal's response to that stimuli will become diminished over and over in increasing amounts. Spontaneous recovery refers to a conditioned response reappearing after a long period of time in which it's not invoked. In his experiment, Pavlov also noticed that the dogs would respond to several different tones that were similar but were not exactly the same. This expresses the concept of generalization. This is where the conditioned stimulus is confused or mixed with other similar stimuli in order to invoke the same response. Generalization can actually be a good thing, like for instance when it comes to toddlers being afraid of moving cars, they'll also generalize all large moving objects into the same category, such as motorcycles or trucks or planes. Anything that's bigger is dangerous to them, they'll associate with the danger of a moving car. So therefore, in that case, generalization can be a positive thing. Pavlov also noticed that over time, the dogs would actually be conditioned to recognize only one particular tone, and they would reject all the other tones. This is known as discrimination. The dogs were able to discriminate against the different sounds as over time they learned that the one particular sound would invoke the response. Ivan Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning is so important even in today's world, as it basically is one way of learning that applies to all animals on the planet, anything from earthworms all the way to humans. So this is why it's important for all of us to recognize that it is one fundamental way that each of us are kind of the same. It is a bare-bone instincts method of learning what's good or bad, and it allows us to thrive and grow and reproduce and evolve over a period of time. On the right hand side of the poster, we have several little graphics. The first four are about Ivan Pavlov's dog experiment, and it basically depicts the dog before conditioning and how it has the food and it's salivating due to the food, and how the sound itself does not invoke the salivation, but when the food and the sound are presented at the same time to the dog the next time will then salivate due to the sound. This basically illustrates the idea of classical conditioning in his experiment. The second graphic is of a girl during a thunderstorm who sees or hears thunder and lightning, and she associates the lightning with the loud boom of the thunder, and therefore the next time she sees the lightning, she will flinch or cringe as she is expecting a loud boom of thunder to follow. This illustrates the idea of classical conditioning allowing us to predict good or bad events. Next up, we'll be covering Chapter 8, which will cover memory.